Welcome to Anonymous HR Stories. Got a workplace scandal that'll make your jaw drop? We're exposing the true tales of HR corruption, nepotism, affair cover-ups, corporate malfeasance, illegal layoffs, and downsizing schemes that your company hoped would stay buried. If you've witnessed HR laws being shattered, whistleblowers being crushed, or management getting away with the kind of stuff that belongs in a courtroom drama, we want your story. Submit your account to anonymoushrstories@gmail.com. Stay anonymous. Expose the truth. The first thing you notice about a paper mill isn't the noise. It's the smell. A sour, damp heaviness that settles into your clothes, your skin, your lungs, something between rotting wood and industrial bleach, with an undertone of sulfur that makes your eyes water the first time you walk through the doors.
By the end of your first shift, you don't smell it anymore, but everyone else does. That's how you know you've been there too long. Daniel had been there 11 years. He didn't plan to stay that long. Nobody plans to stay that long. You tell yourself it's temporary, just until something better comes along, just until you pay off the truck, just until the kids get older. And then one day you're 43 years old with a bad knee and calluses on your hands that don't go away anymore, and the mill is just your life. The way rain is just rain. You stop questioning it. He worked the pulp line, mid-level labor, not quite bottom rung, but not management either. Just enough responsibility to get blamed when something went wrong, not enough authority to stop it from happening.
He supervised 3 guys on day shift and 2 on nights when they needed him to cross over, which was more often than his contract specified, and less often than management pretended it needed to be. The mill ran 24/7. It never stopped. Not for holidays, not for weather, not for funerals. Shifts blurred into each other in a way that made the outside world feel like something you visited rather than something you lived in. The machines never stopped. Logs came in one end, paper rolled out the other. Simple, efficient, profitable, and rotten at the core. Everyone knew about Harris. That was the thing nobody said out loud. That was the understanding that passed between people through glances across the break room, through the way a woman would subtly change her route to avoid walking past a certain office, through the tight smiles that appeared on people's faces when his name came up in conversation. Richard Harris, Plant Operations Manager, late 40s, always in a pressed shirt that didn't belong in a place like that, pale blue or white, always tucked, always with a crease you could cut yourself on. He wore a watch that cost more than most people on the floor made in a month. He'd walk the line during peak hours, hands clasped behind his back like a general reviewing troops, and the floor would get quieter in a way that wasn't respectful. It was something else, something closer to prey awareness. He had a way of talking to men like they were replaceable. He had a way of talking to women like they were something else entirely. It started small. That's how it always starts. Comments. Jokes. Careful, sweetheart. Those machines bite, but not as hard as me. You know, a smile wouldn't kill you. Unless you're saving them for someone special. I put in a good word for you with scheduling. Consider it a gift. From me. Personally. The kind of thing that floats in the air for a moment and then disappears, leaving no trace except a faint residue of wrongness that you couldn't quite name. The kind of thing that, if you complained about it, would be greeted with wide eyes and a patient explanation that you misunderstood. That he was just being friendly, that you were being sensitive. Most people ignored it. Not because they didn't understand what it was, but because they understood exactly what it was and knew the math. The mill paid better than anything else within 40 miles, benefits included, and you could not afford to be the person who made things difficult. That was the culture. Keep your head down, collect your check, don't get involved. There were others before Maya. That's the part of the story that doesn't get told enough. There was Carla, who worked accounts receivable for 8 months before transferring to a facility in another state, a transfer she requested with no explanation and got approved within 48 hours, which told you something if you were paying attention. There was a floor supervisor named Jess who was well-liked, efficient, and on track for promotion until suddenly she wasn't. Until suddenly her evaluation started coming back with language that nobody who'd worked with her would recognize. Words like resistant and not a cultural fit and demonstrates difficulty adapting to leadership direction. There was a temp named Brianna who lasted 6 weeks and never came back after a Thursday shift that she left early, white-faced, without saying goodbye to anyone. Nobody connected the dots, or rather, some people did, but the picture they saw was too large and too dark, and in places like the mill, you learn quickly that some pictures are better left in the corner of your vision. You acknowledge them the way you acknowledge the smell. You let yourself stop noticing. Daniel was not the type to get involved. He had a daughter in middle school and an ex-wife who was technically amicable about the custody arrangement until she wasn't. He had a mortgage on a house that was worth less than when he'd bought it and a truck with a transmission that was approaching the end of its honest life. He was not in a position to make enemies. He was not in a position to be brave. He told himself that a lot. Maya Reyes got hired on a Wednesday in late October. Daniel remembered the day because the weather had been wrong for the season. Too warm, a last gasp of summer that felt more like a warning than a gift. And everyone on the floor was irritable and sweating and looking for something to complain about. She came in with paperwork already completed, uniform already fitted, safety certification already current. She didn't need the full orientation tour because she'd done the same job at a sister facility in another state and knew the equipment better than half the people who'd been running it for years. She transferred in with a quiet confidence that was not arrogance. There's a difference, and most people can feel it, even if they can't articulate it. Early 30s, dark hair kept back in a practical braid, a habit of listening to the full question before she answered it, which in a loud mill environment meant she often tilted her head slightly, eyes focused, clearly processing. She didn't laugh at jokes that weren't funny. She didn't pretend to think things were fine when they weren't. First week on the floor, she started asking questions. Not insubordinate questions, not challenging questions, just questions that suggested she was paying attention, questions that assumed the answer actually mattered. Why is that safety guard bypassed on the number 3 feeder? The bracket's still there. Why are we logging downtime manually? Isn't that what the floor system is for? Why is overtime being assigned off-record? I didn't see it on any of the official shift logs. The questions landed like small stones, dropped into still water. The ripples went out in every direction, and nobody quite knew what to do with them. Because the answers, the real answers, were not answers anyone could say out loud. The real answers were, because that's how we've always done it. Because some things aren't meant to be in writing. Because the people who ask those questions don't last. People didn't like her for it. Not because she was wrong, because she was right. And she was keeping records. That was the part that made people nervous. You could see her, during breaks, writing things down in a small spiral notebook she kept in the chest pocket of her work shirt. Nothing dramatic, just notes, timestamps, observations. The way a person does when they understand that if something goes wrong, the question will be, what did you know, and when did you know it? Harris noticed her almost immediately. Of course he did. Daniel was on the upper catwalk when he first saw Harris watching her, really watching her. The way a man does when he's not trying to hide that he's doing it. Harris stood near the supervisor's station with a coffee he wasn't drinking, his eyes tracking Maya as she moved along the beltline below, calm and methodical, already 3 times more efficient than the guy she'd replaced. Something about the look on Harris's face made Daniel feel the way you feel when you see a car pulling into an intersection just a little too fast, like you know how this ends, like you just don't know exactly when. Daniel was nearby the first time it crossed a line. He was replacing a coupling bolt near the secondary feeder when Harris drifted into the area with the practiced casualness of someone who has learned to make their presence seem accidental. Maya was clearing a paper jam, a minor one, the kind you handle with a quick adjustment and a lever pull, nothing dramatic. She was bent slightly at the waist, focused, efficient. Harris leaned against the railing beside the machine with both hands wrapped around the railing in a way that looked relaxed and wasn't. "You don't have to do all that yourself," he said. His voice had a texture to it, not loud, never loud, just present, in a way that somehow filled the ambient noise. "Could always come to my office. We could figure it out together." Maya didn't look up. "I'm good, thanks." He smiled. Let a moment pass. "You know, you've got a real instinct for this work," he said. "I can always tell. Some people, they're just here. You're actually here. You know what I mean?" I respect that. She kept working. I appreciate that, she said, in a tone that didn't. Harris shifted his weight. A small adjustment, but it brought him slightly closer to her. I take care of my team, he said, quieter now, especially the ones who cooperate, who understand how things work around here. There's a lot of upside in this place for someone like you, if you play things right. Maya stood up, wiped her hands on a rag, and turned to look at him fully. Daniel stopped what he was doing. She looked at Harris the way you look at a math problem, not with hostility, but with a kind of clear-eyed assessment that refuses to be distracted by variables that don't belong in the equation. I'm here to work, she said. That's what I do. Pause. That's it. Harris held her gaze. That smile on his face, the one that didn't quite reach his eyes, didn't disappear. But it shifted. Something moved behind it, the way a current moves under the surface of water that looks still. Sure, he said, eventually. Of course. He pushed off the railing and walked away with the same unhurried gait he always used. Daniel let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding, and he thought, she has no idea what she just started. After that, things got worse, methodically, incrementally, the kind of worse that's designed to look like coincidence if you only look at one piece at a time. Maya's schedule started shifting without notice. She'd come in for a day shift and find herself reassigned to nights without explanation, which meant childcare arrangements, she had a 7-year-old, suddenly became a crisis she had to solve in real time. When she asked about it, she was told it was operational necessity. When she asked for it in writing, she was told that wasn't standard procedure. Her overtime requests got lost. Not denied, lost. Which is worse, because denied gives you something to contest. Lost just gives you a shrug and a promise to look into it that never resolves into anything. She was written up for minor infractions, showing up 3 minutes late on a day her shift had been changed at 11 p.m. the night before. Improperly logging a maintenance issue, except she had logged it correctly, and the error was in the way someone else had entered it into the system after the fact. Using her phone on the floor, which she had done once to photograph a safety concern because that was literally protocol. Everyone around her committed these same infractions daily. Not one of them received written documentation. Safety reports started disappearing. That was the one that kept Daniel up at night. Because Maya was filing a lot of safety reports. Bypassed guards, undocumented maintenance deferrals, chemical storage issues near the bleaching vats that weren't technically illegal yet, but were trending in a direction that suggested someone was playing the odds on inspection schedules. Real issues, documented issues, issues with timestamps and photographs and supporting observations from 2 other workers who'd signed off on them, and they were going in and not going anywhere. Daniel had worked the mill long enough to know the difference between a report that got addressed slowly and a report that got quietly buried. The slowly addressed ones generated some paperwork, some back and forth, some evidence of bureaucratic digestion. The buried ones generated nothing, just silence in the shape of a response. Maya's reports were generating nothing. It happened on a Thursday night shift, graveyard, the kind where everything feels slightly unreal, the fluorescent lights too bright against the darkness outside the high windows, the machines too loud in a building that feels too empty, time moving in a way that doesn't correspond to what the clock says. Daniel was in the maintenance corridor behind the pulp tanks, running a diagnostic on a flow sensor that had been throwing inconsistent readings. Routine work, the kind you can almost do in your sleep after a decade on the line. The adjacent offices, mostly used for shift paperwork and informal supervisory meetings, shared a wall with the maintenance corridor. Sound moved through that building in strange ways. The machinery created a constant background wash that swallowed most conversation. But in the corridor, in the valleys between machine cycles, you could sometimes catch fragments. Harris's office was the 3rd one down. The door was cracked. Daniel wasn't trying to listen. That's the truth. Though he understood later how it might not sound like it. But the tone was wrong. Even from a distance, even muffled, the tone was wrong in a way that made the diagnostic tool go still in his hand. He moved closer without fully deciding to. Harris's voice came through the gap. Dot, you think you can just keep filing complaints and nothing happens? That's not how this works. That's not how any of this works. A pause. Then Maya's voice, controlled, careful, the kind of careful that takes real effort to maintain. I'm documenting safety violations. That's within my job description. That's actually part of compliance protocol. No. Harris's voice dropped into something quieter and more deliberate. Your job is to understand how things actually operate here, not how they look on paper, how they actually work. Silence. You're a smart woman, he continued. The shift in his tone was subtle but unmistakable, from cold to something that was trying to approximate warmth and failing. I've been watching you. You've got skills, real ones, and I would genuinely like to be the person who helps you build something here, a real future, not just a line job. A beat. But that requires trust, a working relationship, some give and take. Maya said nothing. You've got a future here, Harris said, or you don't. That's really up to you. The choice is very simple. Daniel stood in the corridor with his diagnostic tool hanging loose in one hand, and he understood, with the cold clarity that comes from having no room left for ambiguity, that what he was hearing was not a management conversation. It was a transaction, and it was not the first time Harris had tried to make it. He went back to his sensor without making a sound, but he didn't sleep that night. He found the flash drive 3 days later. It was plugged into one of the shared terminals in the break room, the one in the far corner that people used mostly for printing shift reports and occasionally checking their email on break. Small drive, generic black casing, no label. Left there by accident. It had to have been, because if it was left on purpose, what followed doesn't make any sense. No one leaves something like that on purpose. Most people would have ignored it. Daniel almost did. He unplugged it, thought about dropping it in the lost and found box mounted beside the time clock. He stood there with it in his palm for 30 seconds, maybe 40, and then, for a reason he still couldn't fully articulate months later, he took it back to the terminal and plugged it in himself. Inside, dozens of folders, labeled by date, month, day, year, going back almost 3 years. He almost closed it. Then he opened the first folder. Inside, a single video file. He put in earbuds, he pressed play. The angle was from above, upper corner, wide lens, the kind of placement that would blend into infrastructure if you weren't looking for it. The image quality was good, better than it should have been for something unofficial. Harris's office. But not the camera that was supposed to be in Harris's office, the one pointed at the main door for standard security coverage. This was a different camera, a second one, private, installed somewhere above the interior wall, angled down over the desk. In the video, a woman Daniel recognized, accounts receivable. He didn't know her well, but he knew her face. She stood across from Harris's desk, shifting her weight slightly, clearly uncomfortable but trying not to show it. Harris was leaned back in his chair, ankles crossed, completely at ease, like a man in his living room. You've been late 3 times this month, he said. I know, I'm sorry. My mom. It's been complicated, but it won't happen again. I'd like to believe that, Harris said. But you understand, at a certain point, I have a job to do. I know, I'll do better. He looked at her for a long moment, saying nothing, letting the silence do work. There might be another way to handle this, he said finally. Something that resolves the issue, keeps it off the official record. She went very still. What does that mean? He smiled. It means I take care of my people when they take care of me. Daniel stopped the video. His hands were shaking in a way he hadn't expected. He should have closed the drive. That was the reasonable thing to do. That was the safe thing to do. Go find a supervisor, hand it in, wash his hands of whatever this was, and get back to the sensor diagnostics he hadn't finished. Instead, he opened another video. Different woman, different date, same room, same camera, same script with variations. Different pressure points. One was worried about a performance review. One had been accused of a safety violation that seemed, in the context of this video, to have been manufactured for exactly this purpose. One was simply new and clearly hadn't yet understood that the question Harris was asking her had been asked before and would keep getting asked until she answered it one way or the other. He opened another, and And then he sat back from the terminal and stared at the drop ceiling above him and understood what he was looking at. Harris wasn't just harassing, he was documenting it. He had set up a secondary camera system, private, off-network, recording only to local storage on drives exactly like this one, to capture every transaction he initiated. Every conversation in that office, where he offered something and waited to see what he'd receive in return.
At first, Daniel thought, that's insane. Why would you record yourself doing something criminal? And then it hit him. Because the recordings weren't evidence against Harris. They were insurance for him. He wasn't recording his own crimes. He was recording leverage. He was creating an archive of compliance, or non-compliance, that he controlled completely. A private library of moments that could be used or threatened to be used depending on what each woman decided to do next. If she cooperated, the video stayed private, a secret between them. If she didn't cooperate, the video existed. And the framing of that video, seen from the outside, could be made to look like almost anything. Harris talking calmly, her standing there, their voices lowered. Without context, without the full history, it looked like a meeting.
He owned the footage. That meant he owned the story. Daniel found Maya during the B-shift break. She was in the secondary break room, the smaller one, off the east corridor that most people ignored because the coffee machine had been broken for 4 months. She was eating a sandwich and reading something on her phone with the focused attention she gave everything. He sat down across from her. She looked up. "I need to show you something," he said. She studied him for a moment. The way she did everything, without rushing, without filling the silence with noise. "Is this about Harris?" He felt something in his chest tighten. "Yeah." She nodded once, slowly. "Okay." He plugged the drive into the break room terminal, pulled up 2 videos, not the most graphic, but the most clearly representative, the ones where the pattern was unmistakable. She watched them with the kind of stillness that isn't passivity. It's the stillness of someone who is processing very quickly and very carefully, and doesn't want any noise getting in the way of that. When the second video ended, she exhaled slowly through her nose. "How many are on this drive?" "I stopped counting at 32. She was quiet for a moment. "I thought so," she said. Daniel stared at her. "You thought so?" "I've been documenting everything since week 3. She held his gaze, completely calm. His pattern, the scheduling changes, the missing reports. I knew something like this existed. The way he operates, the level of control he has over people who have no reason to be afraid of him and clearly are, that kind of control requires leverage." "It doesn't come from authority alone." She looked at the dark screen. "I just didn't have proof of the mechanism." "You knew he was recording people?" "I suspected he had something. I didn't know it was this." A pause. "This is more than I expected." She picked up her phone and made a call. Daniel sat there, slightly stunned, as she left a brief and cryptic voicemail for someone he didn't know, using language that suggested this wasn't the first time she'd thought through what to do if she found exactly this. When she hung up, she looked at him. "Don't tell anyone you found this. Not yet. Don't mention it to the guys on your line. Don't mention it to anyone in HR." "HR reports to Harris," Daniel said. "I know. She said it the way you say something you've known for a while. That's why we're not going to HR." Maya's external contact was a woman named Diane, who worked in corporate compliance at the parent company's regional office, 3 states away, functionally independent of the individual mill's management structure, and with a direct reporting line that went to legal rather than operations. Maya had met her at an industry safety conference 2 years earlier. They'd stayed loosely in touch. Professional relationship, not personal. But Maya had noted the connection the way careful people note exits, not because they expect to need it, but because it's better to know where it is. She sent Diane a message that was short and specific, and used language calibrated to trigger mandatory reporting obligations rather than voluntary review. Because optional processes can be delayed, mandatory ones cannot. Within 48 hours, they had a secure channel. Over the following week, working in pieces, using equipment that wasn't connected to the mill's network, Maya and Daniel uploaded everything on the drive, every video file, every folder, every date stamp. She added her own documentation, the incident log she'd been keeping in that spiral notebook, transcribed and organized, the paper trail of scheduling changes, screenshots of the missing safety reports, cross-referenced against her own records showing they'd been submitted. She wrote a summary document that was 12 pages and cited specific policy numbers and regulatory codes in a way that suggested she had either done this before or had spent significant time preparing to. Daniel asked her once, while they were working, if she was scared. She thought about it for a moment.
"I'm angry," she said. "There's not a lot of room for scared when you're this angry." Then she thought about it a little more. "Ask me again when it's actually happening." They waited. 2 weeks. In some ways, those were the hardest 2 weeks Daniel had worked at the mill. Not because anything dramatic happened, but because nothing did. The mill ran. Harris walked the floor. People went about their days with no idea that something was in motion. Daniel would pass Harris in the corridor and make eye contact and nod and receive a nod in return and feel the surreal flatness of a world that doesn't know yet that it's about to be different. He watched Maya during those weeks. She was remarkable. She didn't change her behavior in any detectable way. She kept filing her safety reports, still getting no response, which she documented.
She kept showing up for whatever random schedule she'd been assigned. She answered Harris's comments with the same measured neutrality she'd always used. She gave him absolutely nothing to work with. Daniel, by contrast, had to actively suppress the urge to behave differently every time Harris was nearby. The weight of what he knew sat in his chest like a stone. He found himself watching people on the floor and thinking about the folders on that drive. Thinking about the women whose faces he recognized. Thinking about the ones he didn't. He thought about Brianna, who'd left in the middle of a Thursday shift and never came back. He thought about Jess, whose evaluations had transformed overnight from glowing to damning. He thought about all the women who hadn't had a flash drive turn up in their hand by accident, who hadn't had a Maya to tell them what to do with it. He thought about how long this had been happening, and about how many people had known some part of it, and about the collective decision that had been made, not all at once, not formally, but through 1,000 individual moments of looking away to let it keep happening. That weight didn't go away. Even after everything that followed, it didn't entirely go away. They arrived on a Tuesday morning, 2 black SUVs, a gray sedan behind them. They parked in the executive section of the lot in a way that was technically legal and also unmistakably intentional, not tucked away, not discreet, present, announced. The people who got out were in suits that didn't match the corporate casual of the usual visiting brass. There were 4 of them. 2 women, 2 men. One of the women carried a document case. One of the men was clearly legal. You could tell by the way he walked, like someone who understood the difference between what was said and what was proven. Another was from the parent company's internal investigation unit. The 4th, Daniel didn't find this out until later, was from outside the company entirely. They went into the executive wing. A few people on the floor noticed. Curiosity, but not alarm. Suits came through sometimes. It happened. Harris was on the floor when they arrived. Daniel watched from the catwalk as one of the floor managers found Harris near the number 2 press and said something to him, quietly, and Harris nodded and said something back, with the casual confidence of a man who had no reason to think the conversation was anything significant. He went upstairs. He didn't come back down, not in the way he'd gone up. Rumors travel fast in a building where people spend 12 hours together and the machinery is too loud for anything but shouting or close-quarters conversation. By the afternoon break, everyone on the floor knew something was happening. By evening shift changeover, people were saying, investigation. By the night shift, someone who cleaned the hallways near the executive wing reported seeing HR documents and a laptop being removed from Harris's office in sealed containers. The official communication said almost nothing. A memo appeared on the internal system the following morning acknowledging that a personnel review was underway and that operations would continue normally and that employees should direct any questions to their immediate supervisors. It said nothing specific, because companies protect themselves first. That's not cynicism. That's just the reality of institutional behavior. The investigation would determine what had happened. Legal would determine what had to be disclosed. Communications would determine what language to use. And the distance between what had actually occurred in that corner-mounted camera's frame and what would eventually appear in any formal statement would be significant. But the scope of what had been found was already larger than anyone except Maya had expected. Daniel was called in 8 days later. He was taken to an office he'd never been in, not the HR suite, not the floor manager's area, but a conference room in the executive wing that smelled like carpet cleaner and recent repainting, like something new was being stood up in the footprint of something old. Maya was already there. So was a woman from the corporate legal team, early 50s, composed, the kind of composed that comes from having been in a lot of rooms like this one and knowing exactly how they go. And someone else, a man Daniel didn't recognize, who introduced himself only by first name and said he was working with an external team assisting the investigation. The woman from legal looked at Daniel. "Thank you for coming forward," she said. He nodded, didn't know what to say to that. "We're going to need your formal statement," she said, "and your cooperation going forward." "With what specifically?" She and the external investigator exchanged a brief look. "The scope of this has expanded beyond what was initially identified," she said carefully. "The recordings on the device you found, the internal recordings made in the facility, are part of a larger picture." Daniel waited. "Some of those recordings were not retained locally," the external investigator said. "We have evidence that some of the files were transferred to external servers and further distributed." The air in the room changed. "Distributed how?" Daniel said. A pause. "In some cases, commercially." He heard the words. He understood them individually. The combination took a moment to process. Harris hadn't just been recording those conversations as leverage. Some of them, not all, but some, had been copied, encrypted, moved off-site through a private connection, and had ended up in places that charged money for access. The recordings that were supposed to be insurance had become a side business. Daniel felt the break room coffee he'd had an hour ago make a slow turn in his stomach. "The women in those recordings," he said, "we are working with legal counsel to determine the full extent and to ensure that any affected individuals are identified and notified appropriately," the legal woman said, "in the way people in that role speak when they are simultaneously being honest and being careful. They don't know? Some may have had suspicions. None have been formally notified yet. That process is beginning." He thought about Carla, about Jess, about Brianna. He thought about the woman from accounts receivable telling Harris her mother's situation had been complicated. "How long?" he said. No one answered immediately. "We're still determining the timeline," the investigator said. "The earliest files we've identified externally date to approximately 4 years ago." 4 years. The mill ran 24/7. Shifts blurred into each other. The machines never stopped. And for at least 4 years, in a corner-mounted camera above a desk in a pressed shirt office that smelled like industrial bleach and paperwork, and a man's absolute certainty that no one would ever look closely enough, something had been running too. Harris was gone within the week, not just from the facility. His car wasn't in any lot anyone could identify. His house, people looked, because people always look, went dark. A neighbor said she'd seen a moving truck. Officially, terminated, pending investigation. The external investigation team had forwarded findings to authorities. Which authorities, exactly, was not specified in any communication Daniel received. But the external investigator's presence made more sense in retrospect. This was beyond internal review. This was a handoff. It would move slowly. These things always move slowly. Laws cross state lines and jurisdictions, and the legal complexity of what constitutes evidence obtained in what manner, from what system, creates timelines that stretch into years. Daniel was told to preserve any communications, to not discuss the specifics with coworkers, to remain available. He remained available. Maya stayed for 4 months after the investigation began. She used that time to do what she'd apparently been doing since the beginning, documenting, systematically, the structural conditions that had allowed the situation to persist. Not just Harris, but the systems around him. The HR reporting structure that gave operations management effective veto power over personnel complaints. The safety report routing that passed through a filter Harris controlled. the informal culture of looking away that had functioned as an operating system for something that required invisibility to survive. She put it all in writing. She submitted it to corporate compliance, to the external investigative team, and, Daniel found out later, to a regulatory body that had jurisdiction over workplace safety in that industry. Then she accepted a transfer. Cleaner facility, different state, a management structure that had been overhauled 2 years earlier after a different kind of crisis, and that had therefore developed, out of necessity, actual accountability infrastructure. The day before she left, she found Daniel near the number 3 feeder, same spot where Harris had first leaned on the railing and smiled at her, and she handed him a copy of the complaint documentation she'd submitted. "In case anyone asks what actually happened," she said, "will they? Someone should be able to tell them." He took it. "You're going to be okay?" he said, not meaning professionally. She thought about it with that characteristic pause. "I was okay during," she said. "After is easier." She transferred out on a Friday. He didn't see her go. Shift schedules. Daniel stayed, because someone had to. Because he had a daughter and a truck and a mortgage and 11 years of institutional knowledge that didn't transfer anywhere. Because the mill was imperfect and had been rotten in a place he hadn't looked closely at for too long. And he understood now that imperfect things don't improve by being abandoned. A new plant operations manager came in. She was efficient, impersonal in a way that was professional rather than predatory, and she overhauled the safety reporting system within her first 60 days in a way that made Maya's unacknowledged reports look like a blueprint being finally followed. A third-party HR oversight structure got introduced as part of a settlement whose terms were not made public. Safety guards went back on the number 3 feeder. Overtime got logged on record. The shared terminals in the break rooms got wiped and reconfigured with IT oversight. The mill kept running. It always does. Months later, maybe 8, maybe 9, the way time moves in that building, it was hard to be sure, Daniel was walking the east corridor during a slow section of a day shift. He passed Harris's old office. Door open. A different name on the frame now. Different furniture visible inside. Same carpet. He kept walking. And then, almost past it, he stopped. He turned back. He looked at the interior of the room the way you look at something you need to verify. High in the corner, there was a small rectangular scuff on the paint, a slightly different square of wall where something had been removed without quite matching the repaint. The ghost of a bracket, the shadow of a mount, where a camera used to be. He stood there for a long moment. He thought about the drive, about the folders, about the dates going back 3 years, then 4, about all the shifts that had run while that light blinked green in the corner of a room where a man sat behind a desk and waited to see what people would do when they were afraid. He thought about Maya, asking questions no one else dared to ask. He thought about his daughter, who was 12 now, and who would someday work somewhere, in a room that might have corners you'd need to check. He thought about what you owe to people in the spaces you share with them. Then he turned away from the office and kept walking. Because in places like that, places that run 24/7, that produce something and consume something, that are profitable and impersonal and necessary in the way that machines are necessary, you don't fix everything. You can't. The smell gets into your clothes. The shifts blur. The machines don't stop for anyone. But you expose what you can. You document what you see. You don't look away from the questions that deserve answers. And you make sure that the next person, the next Maya, walking in fresh with a spiral notebook and a clear pair of eyes, has somewhere to start. You leave them a map, even if it's just a mark on a wall, even if it's just knowing where to look.